Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening, my friends. It's Sunday night, and you know what that means. Time to dim the lights, settle into your favorite chair, and prepare for some chilling tales to leave you questioning the safety of the world around you. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and tonight I'm joined by my partner in fright, Malcolm Blackwood. Malcolm, how's the fire treating you?
Oh, it's crackling nicely, Otis, and I'm glad to be here with you tonight, sharing stories that peel back the fragile veil between our world and whatever lies beyond. The theme for tonight is one that will leave you questioning reality itself. Shall we begin?
Oh, let's dive in. Tonight's episode brings several tales that will chill you to your core, reminding you that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. If you're enjoying tonight's tales but want even more scares, we've got you covered.
By joining our patrons area, you'll unlock the full extended episode featuring all 5 stories without interruptions, plus our entire Simply Scary Podcast Network archive. All this for just $7.99 per month, or save even more with an annual plan.
Head over to simplyscarypodcast.com and select Patrons in the top menu. You'll be directed to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can start your membership and dive into a world of exclusive horror.
Support indie creators, enjoy ad-free episodes, and double the terror. What could be better?
Our first story tonight comes from the mind of Owen Porter. In it, a man discovers what seems like an ordinary household fixture may in fact be a gateway to something much darker. Prepare yourself for The Pale Green Door, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. Elliot Carter leaned against the wall of the attic, brushing a layer of dust from his jeans. "Looks like whoever lived here before left in a hurry," he muttered, surveying the piles of forgotten belongings. A cracked mirror leaned against the far wall, surrounded by boxes that seemed to slump under the weight of decades. "Or there were hoarders," Lydia replied from across the room, her voice strained as she dragged a heavy box closer to the dim light from the attic window. Her dark curls were pulled into a messy bun, and her face was flushed with exertion. Their new home, a century-old farmhouse tucked into the wooded outskirts of town, was supposed to be their fresh start. After a year of financial setbacks, dashed hopes, and fraying tempers, the low price and secluded location had seemed like a miracle. But less than a week after moving in, the miracle was beginning to feel like a burden. "This box is just full of magazines," Lydia said, prying open the lid and coughing as a puff of dust escaped. "What is it about old houses and ancient garbage?" "Maybe they thought the ads would be worth something someday," Elliot joked, examining a stack of yellowed newspapers. Lydia didn't laugh. She stood abruptly, brushing off her hands and gazing around the attic, as if noticing something for the first time. "Doesn't it feel cramped up here, like the walls are leaning in?" "Yeah, it's just the low ceiling," Elliot said, waving off her concern. "Attics are supposed to feel like this. Come on, let's just get this stuff sorted, so we can figure out what to keep and what to toss." Lydia hesitated, her gaze lingering on a patch of floorboards near the center of the room. "That part of the floor," she said slowly, "it looks different." Elliot followed her gaze. She was right. The boards were a lighter shade, as if they'd been replaced more recently than the rest. He crossed the room, crouching down to run his fingers over the uneven surface. "It's like a patch job," he said. "Maybe they had water damage or something." He tapped the boards lightly. The sound was hollow. Lydia stepped closer, folding her arms tightly. "That's not normal. Why would they replace just this one part?" "It could be storage," Elliot said. "You know, like one of those hidden compartments for valuables." "Skeletons," Lydia muttered. Elliot gave her a look. "Do you want me to check it out or not?" She didn't answer, but the furrow in her brow deepened. Taking her silence as permission, Elliot grabbed a crowbar from the pile of tools they'd left at the attic entrance and began prying at the edges of the lighter boards. The first piece came loose with surprising ease, revealing a recessed square frame. Beneath it was a small green door, its paint chipped and faded. It was no more than 3 feet tall, its brass handle tarnished and rusted. "What the hell is that?" Lydia whispered, taking an involuntary step back. Elliot stared at the door, his curiosity outweighing his unease. There must have been some kind of access point, maybe to wiring or plumbing. Then why is it painted like that? And why is it locked? Lydia pointed to the small brass keyhole just below the handle. Elliot shrugged. It could be decorative. Old houses have weird stuff like this all the time. Probably leads to a crawl space or something. Before Lydia could stop him, he grabbed the handle and turned it. The door opened smoothly, its hinges emitting only the faintest creak. Beyond the door was nothing. A yawning black void stretched downward, utterly silent and lightless. The sight made Lydia's stomach lurch. "That's not a crawl space," she said, her voice tight. Elliot leaned closer, squinting into the darkness. "Looks like a hole. Pretty deep, too." He dropped a loose nail into the void and waited. No sound came back. "Close it," Lydia said abruptly. "What?" "Close it, Elliot. I don't like it." Elliot hesitated, but nodded, shutting the door with a soft click. "It's weird," he admitted, "but it's not dangerous. I'll seal it up later if it makes you feel better." Lydia didn't respond. She watched as Elliot replaced the floorboards, her arms still folded tightly. Her unease didn't fade even after the boards were nailed back into place, and the green door was hidden once again. That night, the door found them again. Elliot woke to the sound of creaking wood, the noise sharp in the stillness of the house. He rolled over, expecting to find Lydia tossing and turning beside him, but her side of the bed was empty. "Lydia?" he called softly, sitting up. A faint green glow filtered through the crack beneath the bedroom closet door. Elliot frowned, his pulse quickening, as he slid out of bed and padded across the room. He opened the closet door and froze. The green door was there, nestled between the hanging clothes and shoe racks. It looked exactly as it had in the attic, except now it seemed slightly larger. What the hell? Elliot? Lydia's voice startled him, and he turned to see her standing in the bedroom doorway, her expression pale and wide-eyed. Why are you up? He gestured toward the closet. It's back. Lydia's gaze followed his hand, and when she saw the door, she gasped. That's impossible. Clearly not, Elliot said, stepping back from the closet. It's the same door, I swear. Lydia approached slowly, as if the door might spring to life and lunge at her. She reached out a trembling hand, but Elliot grabbed her wrist before she could touch it. Don't, he said. We don't know what's behind it. What do you mean? Lydia whispered. I mean, we don't know what it is, Elliot said. It wasn't there before. It shouldn't even fit in this space. Lydia shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. We need to call someone, a contractor or an inspector or... Say what? Elliot interrupted. That a magic door is following us around our house? Do you know how insane that sounds? Lydia glared at him. I don't care how it sounds, Elliot. Something is wrong with this place, and I'm not just going to ignore it. Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine. We'll figure out something in the morning. Just let's get some sleep, okay? Lydia hesitated, but eventually nodded. They shut the closet door and climbed back into bed, though neither of them slept much that night. By the next afternoon, the door was gone. Elliot opened the closet cautiously, half expecting to see the green paint staring back at him. The space was empty. He called Lydia to show her, hoping it might ease her mind. It's gone, he said. See? Probably just some trick of the light. Lydia didn't look convinced. Tricks don't leave hinges behind. She pointed to the faint impressions in the wood where the door had been. Elliot opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself. He knew Lydia was right. No matter how much he tried to rationalize the door's appearance, he couldn't explain the marks it left behind, or the void that seemed to stretch endlessly on the other side. As they stood in the closet, an unspoken agreement passed between them. This wasn't over. Not yet. Part 2. The green door returned 3 days later, but this time it wasn't content to hide in a closet or attic. Elliot first noticed it while fixing a dripping faucet in the bathroom. He glanced up from his work, and there it was, its faded paint almost glowing in the dim light embedded in the wall just above the bathtub. The sight made him drop his wrench, which clattered loudly against the porcelain. "Lydia!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the tiled room. Her footsteps pounded down the hall before she appeared in the doorway. What? What is it? He pointed to the wall. It's back. Her eyes followed his gesture and her face paled. The door looked even larger than before, its frame warped as though it was struggling to contain something inside. This isn't normal, she said, her voice shaking. You think I don't know that? Elliot snapped, the strain of the last few days making his tone harsher than he intended. Lydia flinched, and Elliot softened. I'm sorry, he said quickly. I didn't mean to... Forget it, she interrupted. What do we do now? He didn't have an answer. That night the whispers began. Elliot woke in the early hours to the sound of faint murmurs drifting through the house. They were low and unintelligible, like the voice of someone speaking underwater. He sat up in bed, straining to hear, but the sound vanished as soon as he focused on it. Beside him, Lydia stirred. What's wrong? She mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. Do you hear that? He asked. She blinked at him, confused. You hear what? The voices, Elliot said, feeling ridiculous, even as the words left his mouth. Lydia stared at him for a moment before shaking her head. You're just tired. Come on, back to bed. He wanted to believe her, but the unease in his chest lingered long after she fell back asleep. By the next morning, the green door had moved again. This time, it appeared in the dining room wall, replacing a section of faded wallpaper. "What do you want from us?" Lydia muttered as she stared at it, her hands clenched into fists at her side. Elliot watched her from the kitchen, his unease growing. Lydia had always been calm and rational, but in the past few days she'd become restless and short-tempered, her patience fraying with each new appearance of the door. "You're acting like it's alive," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "Maybe it is," she shot back, her voice sharp. "Can you honestly tell me you don't think it's aware of us?" Elliot didn't reply. He couldn't. That evening, Lydia broke her own rule. Elliot was in the garage, tinkering with the lawnmower, when he heard a scream. He dropped the wrench and ran inside. "Lydia!" he called, skidding to a stop in the living room. She was kneeling in front of the green door, her face pale and her hands trembling. The door was open, revealing a narrow corridor lined with walls that pulsed faintly, as though they were alive. Green veins crisscrossed the surface, glowing softly in the dim light. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's just opened." Elliot crouched beside her, his eyes fixed on the corridor. A faint breeze wafted through the opening, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decay. "Did you go inside?" he asked, his voice tight. She shook her head. "No, but something touched me." He grabbed her hands, examining for any signs of injury. "What do you mean, touched you?" "I don't know," Lydia said, her voice rising. "It was like fingers, but they weren't solid. They felt cold, and now—" She held up her wrist, and Elliot's stomach dropped. A faint green vein snaked its way beneath her skin, glowing softly in the dim light. The following days were a blur of tension and fear. Elliot avoided the green door as much as possible, but Lydia couldn't seem to stay away from it. She spent hours standing in front of it, her gaze fixed on the faintly glowing surface. "It's calling to me," she said one night, her voice distant. Elliot stared at her, his chest tightening. "Lydia, you need to stop. Whatever this thing is, it's not safe." She turned to him, her eyes wide and glassy. "What if it's trying to tell us something? What if it's not dangerous at all?" He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "You don't know that. For all we know, it could be, I don't know, feeding on us or something." "Feeding on us?" she repeated, laughing humorously. "You've been watching too many horror movies." "Lydia, I'm serious," Elliot said, his voice firm. "You need to stay away from that door." She didn't respond. Desperate for answers, Elliot turned to the town's library. The librarian, an older woman named Margaret, raised an eyebrow when he described the strange occurrences in the house. "Sounds like you've got yourself a piece of local history," she said, pulling a dusty volume from the shelf. The book detailed the town's founding families, including the Braddocks, the original owners of Elliot and Lydia's farmhouse. According to the text, the Braddocks had been notorious for their eccentric behavior and rumored involvement with the occult. Margaret leaned closer, lowering her voice. "They say old man Braddock built that house as a sanctuary, a place where he could communicate with the beyond." "What does that mean?" Elliot asked, frowning. Margaret shrugged. "Could mean anything, but if I were you, I'd start looking for a new place to live." When Elliot returned home, he found Lydia sitting cross-legged in the living room, her gaze fixed on the green door. "What are you doing?" he asked, settling his bag down. She didn't look at him. "I think I understand now." "Understand what?" "The door," Lydia said. "It's not random, it's guiding us." Elliot crouched beside her, his heart sinking. "Lydia, listen to me. This isn't normal. Whatever's happening, we gotta get out of here. We need to leave. She finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. Go where? Do you really think it'll let us leave? Her words sent a chill down his spine. That night, Elliot awoke to the sound of the door creaking open. He bolted upright, his eyes darting around the room. The green glow was brighter than ever, spilling into the bedroom like liquid light. "Lydia," he whispered, shaking her shoulder. She didn't stir. Elliot slid out of bed, his movements slow and deliberate. He approached the door, his breath hitching as he peered inside. The corridor was no longer empty. A low hum vibrated through the air, setting his teeth on edge. Nearby, amorphous shadows moved along the walls. As he stepped closer, one of his fingers turned toward him. For a brief moment, it had a face he recognized. His own. Elliot stumbled back, slamming the door shut. The whispers ceased instantly, leaving the house in heavy silence. Part 3. When the green door reappeared again, it was no longer just a haunting presence. It was a prison. Elliot awoke to find that every exit in the house had vanished, replaced by copies of the same pale green door. The front door, the windows, even the sliding door to the back porch, all gone. The walls were lined with the warped, cracking wood of the green doors, each one identical, their brass knobs tarnished and faintly glowing. "Lydia!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. She rushed into the living room, her face pale and drawn. "Elliot, what's happening? I can't get out of the bedroom. The windows are gone. Everything's—" She stopped when she saw the room. Dozens of green doors stretched across the walls, stacked in unnatural rows that defied the house's geometry. "We're trapped," Elliot said grimly. Lydia's hands trembled as she approached one of the doors. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This can't be real." "Don't touch it," Elliot warned, grabbing her wrist. "What choice do we have?" she snapped, pulling away. "We can't just sit here and wait for whatever this is to get worse." Her words echoed in the silent room as if the house were mocking them. The couple tried every door, but no matter which one they opened, they all led back to the living room. Some revealed identical copies of the room, while others opened onto a dark, featureless void. By mid-afternoon, they were exhausted. Lydia sat cross-legged on the floor, her head resting in her hands. Elliot paced the room, his jaw clenched as he studied the doors. "There has to be a way out," he muttered. "What if there isn't?" Lydia said softly. He froze, turning to her. "Don't say that." She lifted her head, her eyes glassy. "What if this is it, Elliot? What if the house, the door, it's never going to let us leave?" "We'll figure it out," he insisted, though his voice wavered. "We just need to think." He glanced at the largest door, which had appeared in the center of the far wall. It was taller than the others, its paint darker, and its frame seemed to shimmer faintly, as though it were vibrating. "That one," he said, pointing. "That's the one we haven't tried." Lydia hesitated. "What if it's worse than the others? Or what if it's the way out?" Elliot countered. They stared at the door in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken fear. Finally, Lydia stood. "Okay," she said, "but we go together." The door swung open smoothly, revealing a forest bathed in a sickly green light. Trees were impossibly tall, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in a thick layer of moss that squelched underfoot. Elliot and Lydia stepped through cautiously, the air around them thick and humid. The forest hummed faintly, as if alive, and the green light seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. "This place is wrong," Lydia said. Elliot nodded, his eyes scanning their surroundings. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the twisted trunks of the trees disappearing into the distance. "We need to keep moving," he said. "Maybe there's a path or something that can lead us out." They walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of moss beneath their shoes and the faint hum of the forest. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a group of unusual figures standing in a small clearing. At first, Elliot thought they were statues. They were motionless, their translucent skin glowing faintly in the green light. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and their clothes hung in tatters. "Hello?" Lydia called hesitantly. The nearest figure turned its head slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its mouth opened, but the voice that came out was soft and echoing, as though it were speaking from a great distance. "You shouldn't be here," it said. Elliot stepped in front of Lydia, his hands clenched into fists. "We didn't mean to come here. We are just trying to get back home." The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes fixed on him. "The door only opens for those who are willing to give. You've already given, whether you meant to or not." "What does that mean?" Lydia asked, her voice trembling. Another figure stepped forward, its movement as jerky as the first. "It means you cannot leave without paying the price." Elliot's chest tightened. "What price?" The figures didn't answer. Instead, they turned and began to walk away, their glowing forms disappearing into the shadows. The couple continued deeper into the forest, their unease growing with each step. The green light seemed to grow brighter, and the hum of the forest grew louder, vibrating through their bones. Eventually, they came to another clearing. In the center stood a tree unlike any they'd ever seen before. Its trunk was smooth and glowing, its branches reaching upward like skeletal fingers. The light it emitted was brighter than the rest of the forest, almost blinding. Lydia took a step toward it, her breath hitching. "It's beautiful," she said. Elliot grabbed her arm. "Lydia, no. We don't know what it is." "It's the way out," she said, her voice distant. "I can feel it." "Feel what?" he demanded. She turned to him, her eyes wide and glassy. "It's speaking to me, Elliot. It's telling me we can go home. We just have to accept its offer." Elliot's stomach churned. "What offer, Lydia? Listen to me. This thing isn't trying to help us. It's trying to trap us." She shook her head, pulling away from him. "You don't understand. It's showing me the way. We can be free, Elliot. We just have to let it take us." Before he could stop her, she stepped forward and placed her hand on the tree. The moment Lydia touched the tree, the light intensified, and the forest erupted in a deafening hum. Green veins spread from the tree's trunk, crawling up Lydia's arm and sinking into her skin. "Lydia!" Elliot shouted, rushing to pull her away. She turned to him, her face twisted in a mixture of pain and ecstasy. "It's okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can see it now. The door, the other side. It's so close." Elliot grabbed her shoulder, shaking her. "You don't know what you're saying. This thing's killing you." "It's not killing me," she whispered. "It's freeing me." The veins continued to spread, creeping up her neck and down her torso. Elliot let out a cry of desperation, his mind racing. He needed to act fast, or he would lose her forever. He looked around frantically and spotted a jagged rock in the ground. Without thinking, he grabbed it and began hacking at the veins binding Lydia to the tree. The tree let out a sound that could only be described as a scream, its branches writhing as though in agony. The veins recoiled, retreating back into the trunk. Lydia collapsed into Elliot's arms, her body trembling. The green veins on her skin faded, leaving faint scars behind. "We need to go," Elliot said, his voice shaking. Lydia nodded weakly, leaning on him as they stumbled away from the tree. As they fled the clearing, the forest began to collapse. The trees writhed and twisted, their branches snapping like bones. The green light dimmed, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through their bodies. Elliot glanced back and saw indistinct figures emerging from the collapsing trees, moving with unnatural speed. Don't look back, he shouted, tightening his grip on Lydia's arm. The green door appeared ahead of them, flickering like a mirage. They sprinted toward it, their lungs burning and their legs trembling. Just as the wraith-like figures closed in, they dove through the door, slamming it shut behind them. They collapsed onto the floor of their living room, gasping for air. The house was silent, the green door gone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Is it over?" Lydia whispered. Elliot stared at the spot where the door had been, his chest heaving. "I don't know," he said. Part 4. The world outside the door was dim and unfamiliar. Elliot and Lydia had escaped the forest, but the house that they now stood in was not the same one they had entered. The walls were warped and covered in patches of moss. The air felt damp and heavy, carrying a faint scent of decay. Elliot helped Lydia to a chair in the living room. Her skin was pale, and faint green scars etched up her arms like veins of marble. She stared at the floor, her expression distant. "Are you okay?" Elliot asked, crouching beside her. She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers traced the faint scars on her arms, her lips trembling. "I can still feel it," she whispered. "Feel what?" "The tree," she said, her voice hollow. "It's inside me. It's not gone." Elliot gripped her hands tightly. "You're out now. Whatever that thing is, it can't reach you anymore. We're safe." She shook her head slowly. "You don't understand. It's still connected to me. It's waiting." "Lydia," he said firmly, "we're going to get through this. We just need to figure out what's happening. You have to fight it." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he thought he saw something flicker in them, something green and alien. Then she blinked and it was gone. Over the next few days, the tension between them grew. The house seemed to resist their attempts to clean it. No matter how much Elliot scrubbed, the moss returned, creeping up the walls like ivy. The windows fogged over with moisture, and the floors felt soft underfoot. Lydia spent most of her time in the living room, staring at the spot where the largest green door had been. She barely ate or slept, her energy consumed by some invisible weight. Elliot, desperate for answers, returned to the library. Margaret, the librarian, raised an eyebrow when he walked in, his disheveled appearance betraying his fraying nerves. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her tone half joking. Elliot forced a weak smile. Something like that. He spent hours poring over books on local legends, occult practices, and supernatural phenomena. One passage in an old text caught his eye. The Green Gate, a portal said to connect the mortal world to the beyond. Those who open the gate must sacrifice something precious to pass through, but the gate always demands more than one expects. Beware of its lure, for the beyond never lets go. Elliot slammed the book shut, his chest tightening. When he returned home, he found Lydia in the kitchen, her back to him. She was humming softly, a melody he didn't recognize. "Lydia?" he said cautiously. She turned slowly, and his stomach sank. Her eyes were brighter than before, the faint green glow now unmistakable. "You're back," she said, her voice light and almost cheerful. "I was starting to think you'd left me." "What's going on?" he asked, his voice shaking. "What's happening to you?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing you need to worry about. I'm fine, Elliot, really." "You're not fine," he said, stepping closer. "Look at yourself. Look at what it's doing to you. She tilted her head, her smile fading. It's not doing anything to me. It's helping me. Helping you, he repeated, incredulous. Lydia, it's taking over. You're not yourself anymore. Her expression darkened. Maybe I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be. That night, Elliot woke to find Lydia gone. The bed beside him was cold, and the faint hum of the green door echoed through the house. Lydia! He called, his voice breaking the silence. There was no response. He got out of bed, anxiety welling up inside him, and followed the hum to the living room. She was standing in the center of the room, her hand outstretched toward an invisible point in the air. The scars on her arms glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the hum. Lydia! He shouted, running to her. She didn't turn. Her eyes were fixed on the empty space in front of her, her lips moving silently as though reciting a prayer. Lydia, stop! Elliot grabbed her shoulders and shook her. Her head snapped toward him, her eyes wide and glowing. Don't touch me, she said, her voice layered with an otherworldly resonance. Elliot stumbled back, his blood running cold. What's happening to you? It's almost time, she said, ignoring his question. I have to go back. It's calling me. No, he said firmly. You're staying here with me. Her expression softened, and for a moment, she looked like herself again. Elliot, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. I don't have a choice. Yes, you do, he insisted, grabbing her hands. We'll fight this, together. She pulled away, her tears spilling over. You don't understand. If I don't go, it'll take you instead. The next day, Elliot found her in the yard, standing beneath a twisted oak tree. She was barefoot, her hair tangled, and her arms raised toward the sky. Lydia, please, he said, his voice raw. She turned to him, her face serene. It's not what you think, she said. It's not evil, Elliot. It's just different. It wants to share its world with us. He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. That's not sharing. That's taking. It's taking you away from me. She stepped closer, her glowing eyes locking onto his. You could come with me, she said softly. We could be together forever. What are you talking about? Elliot asked. It's opening the door for us, she said. We just have to step through. Her hand reached for his, but he pulled away. No, he said firmly. I'm not going to let it have you. You don't have a choice, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Neither of us does. That night the green door returned. It was larger than ever, its frame pulsing with light. The hum was deafening, vibrating through the walls and floor. Elliot knew what he had to do. He found Lydia standing in front of the door, her hand resting on the handle. The green scars on her arms glowed brighter, spreading up her neck and across her chest. Don't do this, he pleaded. She turned to him, her face expressionless. It's too late. No, it's not, he said, stepping closer. You can fight it. You don't have to let it win. She hesitated, her hand trembling on the handle. It's stronger than me, Elliot. I can't stop it. Yes, you can, he said, grabbing her shoulders. You're stronger than this. I know you are. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment the green glow dimmed. Elliot. But before she could finish, the door burst open, and a surge of green light flooded the room. Elliot acted on instinct. He grabbed a jagged piece of wood from the broken door frame and slashed at the veins, binding Lydia to the door. She screamed, her body convulsing as the veins recoiled. The door let out a deafening wail, its light flickering like a dying flame. Hold on, Elliot shouted, pulling her away. The veins snapped and withered, retreating into the door. Lydia collapsed into his arms, her body trembling violently. The door began to shrink, its light fading until it was no more than a faint outline on the wall. Elliot held Lydia tightly as the last remnants of the door disappeared. "It's over," he whispered. "You're safe now." Her eyes fluttered open, and she smiled weakly. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. Part 5. The house had quieted after the door disappeared, but the silence was anything but comforting. Elliot paced the living room, his eyes darting to the walls and corners, waiting for the faint green glow to return. Lydia sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, staring blankly ahead. "It's not over," Elliot said, breaking the silence. Lydia didn't respond. She looked like a ghost of herself, her skin pale and her green scars faint but still visible. "Lydia," Elliot said, crouching in front of her, "I need you to tell me everything. What did it say to you? What did it show you?" She blinked slowly, her gaze drifting to his. "It said we were chosen," she whispered. "That the door wasn't an accident, it was looking for us." "For us?" Elliot asked, his stomach twisting. "Why us?" She shook her head. I don't know. It just knew. It knew everything about me, about us. It showed me things, Elliot, things that felt real." "What things?" he pressed. She hesitated, her voice trembling. "It showed me a life where we were happy, where nothing ever went wrong. It said it could give that to us, that all I had to do was accept." Elliot clenched his jaw, anger and fear bubbling inside him. "It lied to you, Lydia. That wasn't real. It's manipulating you." "I know," she said softly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But for a moment, I wanted it to be real." That night the house began to change again. Elliot woke to the sound of creaking wood and a faint rhythmic thrum. He sat up and saw the walls shifting, the plaster cracking as green veins spread like ivy. "Lydia!" he shouted, leaping out of bed. She was already standing in the doorway, her face illuminated by the faint green glow. "It's coming back," she said, her voice hollow. The veins pulsed and the hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor. Elliot grabbed Lydia's hand, pulling her into the living room. "We have to get out of here," he said. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked, her tone almost resigned. Elliot opened his mouth to respond, but a deafening crack interrupted him. The largest green door yet appeared on the far wall, its frame pulsating violently. "No!" Elliot muttered, his grip on Lydia tightening. "I'm not letting it take you." "It's not going to take me," Lydia said, her voice strange. "It's going to take us both." The door swung open and the forest on the other side was darker than before. The twisted trees loomed impossibly high, their branches writhing like serpents. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, and figures, shrouded in darkness, moved in the distance. Elliot stepped in front of Lydia, shielding her. "We're not going back in there," he said. The hum grew louder, and the figures began to move closer. "They won't stop until we step through," Lydia said. Elliot turned at her, his face pale. "We'll find another way." "There isn't another way," she said, her voice filled with despair. The wraiths were almost upon them when Elliot made his decision. Grabbing Lydia's hand, he pulled her through the door, the forest swallowing them whole. Inside the forest, time lost meaning. The green glow was dimmer than before, but the hum persisted, vibrating through the trees. Elliot and Lydia moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick moss covering the ground. "We need to find a tree," Lydia said suddenly. "What?" Elliot stopped, staring at her. "The tree," she repeated. "It's the only way. If we destroy it, the door won't have power anymore." Elliot frowned. "And how do you know that?" "It told me," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to, but I saw it in my mind. The tree is the source." He hesitated, but the determination in her eyes convinced him. "Then we find the tree," he said. The tree was in a clearing just as before, its glowing trunk pulsating with a sickly green light. Elliot and Liddy approached cautiously. "What now?" Elliot asked. Lydia reached into her pocket and pulled out a jagged piece of wood he'd used to sever the veins before. "We destroy it," she said simply. Elliot nodded, gripping the wood tightly. As he stepped toward the tree, the ground beneath him trembled, and a deafening roar echoed through the forest. The figures emerged from the trees, surrounding the clearing. Their forms were barely human, their limbs elongated and distorted. "Hurry!" Lydia shouted. Elliot didn't hesitate. He drove the jagged wood into the tree's trunk with all his strength. The tree let out a piercing scream, and the veins on its surface writhed violently. The green light intensified, blinding them. "Keep going!" Lydia yelled, grabbing a large branch and striking the tree alongside him. The wraiths closed in, their shapes twisting and melting into one another. Elliot ignored them, focusing all his energy on the tree. Finally, with a final strike, the tree cracked. Its glowing light flickered and the hum stopped abruptly. The shadowy figures froze, their forms dissolving into green mist. The forest began to collapse. The trees twisted and fell, their branches disintegrating into ash. The ground beneath them cracked and shifted, threatening to swallow them whole. "The door!" Lydia shouted, pointing to a faint green glow in the distance. Elliot grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the light. They ran as the forest fell apart around them, the air filled with the sound of cracking wood and rushing wind. The door loomed ahead, flickering like a mirage. They dove through it just as the forest disappeared, slamming it shut behind them. The house was silent when they returned. The green door was gone, and the walls were bare. Elliot collapsed onto the floor, struggling to catch her breath. Lydia sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Is it over?" she asked softly. He didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the spot where the door had been. For now, the house was quiet, but deep down, Elliot wondered if it would stay that way. Part 6. The new apartment was unremarkable in every way. A drab, boxy building in the middle of the city with thin walls and perpetually buzzing fluorescent lights. It wasn't the type of place Elliot had imagined for them, but after the farmhouse, unremarkable was exactly what they needed. Lydia sat by the window, staring out at the busy street below. She'd been doing that a lot lately, watching the world but never engaging with it. Her pale skin had regained some color, but the scars on her arms remained. Faint green lines etched into her flesh like a reminder of what they'd escaped. Elliot placed a steaming cup of tea on the table beside her. "Here," he said gently. She glanced at him, managing a small smile. "Thanks." He sat across from her, nursing his own cup. For a while they sat in silence, the faint hum of the city filling the empty space between them. "Do you really think it's really over?" Lydia asked suddenly. Elliot hesitated, staring down at his cup. "I want to believe it is," he said. "But you don't," she said, her tone flat. He looked up at her, his jaw tightening. "I don't know, Lydia. How can I know after everything we've been through?" She nodded, her gaze returning to the window. "I can still feel it sometimes," she said. "Like it's watching me." Elliot didn't respond. He had felt it too, the faintest sensation, like a pair of eyes in the back of his neck or a shadow in the corner of his vision that disappeared when he turned to look. The days blurred together as they tried to rebuild their lives. Elliot threw himself into work, taking on long hours to distract himself from the memories that refused to fade. Lydia stayed home, spending her days cleaning their already spotless apartment and sitting by the window. One evening, Elliot came home to find her sitting on the floor in the bedroom, surrounded by sheets of paper. Each one was covered in intricate sketches of doors, green doors, all slightly different but unmistakably the same. "Lydia," he said, his voice cautious, "what are you doing?" She didn't look up. "I keep dreaming about them," she said. "Every night. They're always there, just out of reach." He crouched beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "They're just dreams," he said. "They don't mean anything." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. What if they do? Elliot started locking the bedroom closet at night. He told himself it was for Lydia's sake, but deep down he knew it was for his own peace of mind. Despite his efforts, the unease lingered. The faint hum he thought he'd left behind seemed to follow him, vibrating at the edge of his senses. He told himself it was just his imagination, a remnant of the trauma they'd endured. But then came the night he woke to find Lydia standing by the closet. "Lydia," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. She didn't respond. Her hand was on the closet door, her fingers tracing the wood as if searching for something. He got out of bed, crossing the room cautiously. "Lydia, what are you doing?" She turned to him slowly, her expression blank. "It's here," she said. "What's here?" he asked, his stomach twisting. She pointed to the closet. "The door." "No, it's not," Elliot said firmly. "The door's gone, Lydia. It's over." But even as he said the words, he felt the hum in the air, growing louder with each passing second. Next morning, Lydia didn't mention the incident, and Elliot didn't press her. He wanted to believe it had been a dream, a trick of his exhausted mind. But over the following days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He started noticing small things: a faint green glow under the bedroom door at night, the sound of creaking wood when the apartment was still. One evening, as he sat in the living room reviewing paperwork, the lamp beside him flickered. He looked up and froze. A faint outline of a door shimmered on the far wall, just for a moment, before disappearing. "Lydia," he called, his voice trembling. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "What is it?" Elliot gestured to the wall. "Do you see that?" She frowned, stepping closer. "See what?" He stared at the wall, his pulse racing. The door was gone, but the memory of it lingered. "Nothing," he said finally. "It's nothing." But he knew it wasn't. A week later, Elliot woke in the middle of the night to find the bedroom bathed in a faint green light. He sat up. There it was again. The door was back. It was smaller than before, its paint chipped and faded, but there was no mistaking it. It stood at the foot of their bed, its brass handle gleaming faintly. Elliot stared at it, frozen. Beside him, Lydia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Elliot?" she murmured sleepily. "Don't look," he said quickly. But it was too late. Her eyes widened as she saw the door, and a faint smile spread across her lips. "You came back," she whispered. Elliot grabbed her hand, his grip tight. "We're not going through it," he said firmly. "Do you hear me? We're not going back." She didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the door, her expression unreadable. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the door. The door's frame pulsed faintly, its green light spilling onto the floor like liquid. Elliot tightened his grip on Lydia's hand, his voice shaking. "We're not going back," he repeated. But deep down, He wasn't sure if they had a choice. That was The Pale Green Door by Owen Porter, performed by me, Otis Jiry. Malcolm, ever had a door in your home that you were just a little too afraid to open?
Not recently, but I have learned the hard way that curiosity can be perilous. Sometimes it's best to leave things closed, wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Speaking of forbidden knowledge, let's move on to our next story, where discovery comes at a terrifying cost.
Our second tale tonight is by J.P. Netherane, and it follows an archivist whose obsession with an ancient journal leads to revelations and consequences beyond comprehension. Without further ado, I present Journal of a Dead World, performed by me, Malcolm Blackwood. Part 1. I must begin this account by imploring the reader to turn away, to consign this text to flame or ocean, and seek no further knowledge of the horrors it records. What I have seen, what I have done, it has unraveled the fragile threads of my sanity, leaving only tatters where once resided certainty and comfort. Yet, I persist in recounting this tale, for the folly that ensnared me may soon ensnare you. If you have found this journal, it is already too late. My descent into madness began with the discovery of a journal unlike any other. I was employed at the time as an archivist for the Alderberry Collection, a modest but peculiar repository of artifacts housed in a crumbling Gothic structure on the outskirts of Thornwood. The collection was notorious for its eclectic inventory, rusted implements of dubious utility, untraceable curios, and tomes in languages no living scholar could identify. It was a haven for forgotten things and, as I would soon discover, things best left forgotten. The journal came to my attention during the cataloguing of an unsorted crate delivered from an estate sale in southern Devon. Its arrival had gone unnoticed for weeks, buried beneath more conventional items, faded oil paintings, cracked porcelain, and a brass telescope whose lenses were inexplicably clouded. When I unearthed the journal, I was immediately struck by its uncanny nature. Bound in a material I could not identify, the cover bore a texture that was neither leather nor cloth, but something disquietingly organic, as if it were alive once, but no longer. The pages, despite their antiquity, were unyielding to the slightest crease, and they emitted a faint metallic sheen under lamplight. Etched upon the cover were symbols that seemed to shift subtly when viewed from the corner of one's eye, a phenomenon I dismissed initially as fatigue. Inside, the writing defied immediate comprehension. It was a chaotic amalgamation of languages, ancient runes interspersed with characters resembling mathematical formulae, and, most disturbingly, fragments of modern script in unmistakable English. The latter appeared hastily scrawled, as if their author had been in mortal peril while committing them to the page. Phrases such as, "The veil is thinning," and "We failed to appease it," leapt out at me, their ominous implications gnawing at my thoughts. The journal's unnerving quality was not confined to its contents. Upon prolonged contact, I became aware of a subtle vibration emanating from it, faint but perceptible, like the hum of a far-off engine or the breathing of some slumbering beast. It grew stronger when my hands rested on its surface, and I could not shake the impression that it responded to my touch. I attempted to put it aside, to continue my work cataloging the remaining items in the crate, but an inexplicable compulsion drove me to return to the journal. It was as though an invisible thread bound me to it, tightening with each passing moment. I reasoned that deciphering its contents would banish the unease it stirred within me. Instead, it would become the catalyst for my undoing. Using my modest proficiency in ancient languages, I began translating portions of the text. Progress was slow, for the symbols defied conventional grammar and syntax, but certain fragments emerged with terrifying clarity. "They came from the void beyond the stars," one passage read, "and the air itself betrayed us." Another warned, "Do not follow the lights, they lead only to hunger." What struck me most was the increasing sense that these words were not meant for the author's kin or kind, but for some distant and alien audience, perhaps even for us. As I labored over the journal, peculiar phenomena began to manifest in my immediate surroundings. The shadows cast by my desk lamp seemed darker and more defined, as though imbued with a depth that defied natural light. Faint whispers emerged in the stillness of the archive, too indistinct to decipher, but unmistakably real. My colleagues dismissed my concerns, attributing them to long hours and the isolating quiet of the collection. But I knew better. Something had awakened in me, or perhaps around me, and it was inextricably tied to the journal. By the end of the first week, I could no longer deny the compulsion that had overtaken me. I took the journal home, defying the strict protocols of the Aldebaran collection. It was a reckless decision, one that I would come to regret profoundly, but at the time I rationalized it as necessary for more intensive study. The house I rented was a modest affair on the edge of the village, surrounded by dense woods that muffled the din of civilization. It was there, in the oppressive solitude of those nights, that the journal began to reveal its true nature. In the small hours of the morning, as I pored over its pages by the light of a flickering candle, I encountered a passage that froze the blood in my veins. "To hold this tome is to invite the gaze of that which watches," it read, "and once it sees, it does not look away." My hand trembled, and the candle's flame guttered, casting the room into a restless dance of shadows. For the first time, I considered abandoning the journal, consigning it to the fire, or burying it deep within the earth. Yet even then, I knew such measures would be futile. The journal had found me, and it would not let me go. Part 2. The journal's mysteries consumed me utterly, and with each passing night its sinister pull tightened. I began to dream, not of mundane concerns or trivial memories, but of a world not my own. These dreams were vivid beyond description, suffused with sights, sounds, and sensations so alien that my mind rebelled at their recollection. Even now I struggled to put them into words, for what I beheld seemed to mock the very foundation of human perception. The visions began as fragments. I saw a vast and arid plain beneath a sky that defied the natural order. A sky not blue or gray, but a sickly green hue streaked with veins of black lightning. Towering spires of obsidian-like material jutted upward at impossible angles, casting shadows that seemed to writhe with unnatural vitality. The ground was scorched and cracked, exhaling thin tendrils of vapor that reeked of sulfur and decay. Amid these desolate landscapes, there were remnants of a once mighty civilization. The ruins were immense, their architecture cyclopean and profoundly alien. There were no straight lines, no angles that conformed to human understanding of geometry, only arcs and spirals that seemed to twist inward upon themselves. As I walked through these forsaken streets, a growing sense of unease settled over me, as though the very air resented my presence. It was not long before I realized that I was not alone in these dreams. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision. indistinct forms, too indistinct to describe, yet imbued with a palpable malevolence. They did not approach, but their presence was a torment in itself. Worse still were the sounds, faint whispers that carried no words, only a malign intent, and a deep, rhythmic drumming that seemed to emanate from the very ground. When I awoke from these dreams, drenched in sweat and trembling, I would find the journal open beside me. Though I was certain I had closed it before retiring, its pages lay bare, revealing fresh passages that I had not yet deciphered. These passages were more coherent than the others, as though the journal's author, or authors, had anticipated my dreams and sought to guide me. Their warnings were explicit and horrifying. "We knew it as the devourer of realities," one passage read. "It feeds not on flesh, but on the essence of worlds, hollowing them out until only an echo remains." Another described its approach. "It begins with the subtle unraveling of the familiar. The lights falter, the air thickens, and the ground becomes a stranger beneath one's feet. Then comes the silence, and after that, nothing." The author's desperation bled through every word. They described how their people had sought to halt the entity's advance through rituals and sacrifices, but all such efforts had failed. The force they called the Devourer was beyond comprehension, let alone defiance. It was not evil in the sense that humans understand the term. It was simply hunger, vast and infinite, devouring without malice or mercy. As I read, a horrifying realization dawned on me. The events described in the journal bore an uncanny resemblance to recent occurrences in our own world. Reports of unexplained phenomena, massive bird migrations, strange weather patterns, and entire villages going eerily silent had begun to surface in the news. I recalled an article about a research station in the Arctic where the staff had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only cryptic scrawlings on the walls and equipment that seemed inexplicably corroded. At first, I dismissed these connections as mere coincidence, the product of an overactive imagination inflamed by the journal's contents. But the coincidences became harder to ignore. One night, as I flipped through the journal's pages, I found an entry that described a phenomenon known as the thinning of the veil. It was said to manifest as a black fog that crept across the land, consuming all it touched and leaving behind only a barren wasteland. That same night, the fog appeared in my dreams. I saw it slithering through the dead world's ruins, an inky tide that swallowed entire structures and blotted out the grotesque sky. Within the fog were shapes, shifting and amorphous, and their movements suggested both hunger and an unearthly intelligence. The fog seemed to move with purpose, yet its purpose was beyond my grasp. When I awoke, the air in my room felt heavier, as though tainted by the dream. The shadows cast by the flickering candle seemed darker, and for a moment I was certain they moved independently. My hand trembled as I reached for the journal, compelled once more to seek answers. I knew this compulsion was dangerous, but the alternative, ignorance, seemed even more perilous. It was during this fevered state of study that I uncovered the journal's most chilling revelation. Scattered throughout its pages were fragments of prophecy, warnings that transcended the boundaries of time and space. One passage in particular struck me with the force of a physical blow. The devourer comes to all worlds, but its arrival is not without heralds. It sends its whispers ahead, sowing disarray and fear. When the veil thins, it is already too late. I began to keep track of the parallels between the journal's warnings and the events unfolding on Earth. The pattern was undeniable. The world's unraveling had already begun, and I had no doubt that the journal was part of that process. It was not merely a record of a dead world's last moments. It was a message sent across the void to warn or perhaps to entrap. The nights that followed were an unrelenting torment. My dreams became more vivid, more visceral, and the line between vision and reality began to blur. I would wake to find objects in my room displaced, their position subtly altered as though by unseen hands. Once, I heard faint whispers emanating from the journal itself, a sound so soft and fleeting that I questioned my own senses. Despite these terrors, I could not stop. The journal's revelations were a siren song, pulling me ever deeper into the abyss. I knew, even then, that my pursuit of its secrets would lead to my ruin. But I also knew that the knowledge it contained was the only hope of understanding the horrors to come, and perhaps, just perhaps, of delaying them. Part 3. It began with the shadows. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind wrought by exhaustion and the relentless gloom of my solitary nights. But as the days wore on, I could no longer deny the truth. The darkness in my home had taken on a life of its own. Shadows no longer moved as they should. They stretched unnaturally, pooling in corners and along walls in defiance of the flickering lamplight. At times I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, a faint, slithering motion. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. My dreams, already a source of torment, became unbearable. The visions of the dead world intensified, growing more coherent yet infinitely more horrifying. I saw its final days with a clarity that robbed me of breath. Its skies had turned black, its air poisoned by the fog that crept like a living tide. The last remnants of its people huddled in their strange cities, their distorted architecture twisted even further by the encroaching madness. They whispered prayers to gods long dead, their faces masks of despair. Then came the screams. The voices of the dead echoed in my mind even after I awoke. Their cries blending into the faint, rhythmic drumming that now seemed to emanate from the journal itself. I had moved it to my study, determined to keep it away from my bedroom, but it was as though the thing radiated an aura that no walls could contain. The whispers, indistinct but malevolent, pervaded every corner of my home, growing louder the longer I ignored them. By the second week, I could no longer trust my senses. Objects shifted inexplicably, their positions altering when I looked away. The air grew heavy, suffused with a subtle vibration that made my teeth ache and my limbs tremble. I would hear faint scratching sounds at night, as though something vast and unseen was brushing against the walls of my home. Sleep became a distant memory, and my every waking moment was consumed by the journal's horrors. Desperation drove me to seek help, though I knew not where to turn. My colleagues at the Alderberry Collection had already dismissed my growing paranoia as the ravings of an overworked mind. The internet offered no solace, its forums teeming with skeptics and charlatans. In the end, I sought out a retired linguist by the name of Professor Armitage, whose expertise in ancient languages was unparalleled. He agreed to examine the journal, though his tone suggested more curiosity than belief. When I delivered the journal to him, I noticed an immediate change in his demeanor. His jovial expression faded, replaced by a furrowed brow and a pallor that deepened as he turned its pages. "This," he murmured, his voice trembling, "this cannot be." He traced the strange symbols with a shaking finger, his eyes darting nervously about the room as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice hoarse from days of silence. "These symbols," he said, "are not merely language, they are invocations, summons." He shut the journal with a sharp motion, as though the act itself were a ward against its influence. "You must destroy this immediately." "But no," his voice cracked with an urgency that chilled me. "You do not understand what you've brought into your home. This is not a record. It is a beacon." Before I could respond, he thrust the journal back into my hands and ordered me to leave. As I stepped outside, I heard the sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place behind me, followed by the unmistakable click of a lock. I turned to glance back at his house, but froze when I saw the faint glow of light behind his curtains suddenly extinguish. The next day, I learned that Professor Armitage had vanished. His house was found locked from the inside, his belongings untouched, but there was no sign of him anywhere. His disappearance was the first, but it would not be the last. The unraveling of reality continued unabated. News reports spoke of mass disappearances in isolated regions. Entire villages wiped clean of life, leaving behind nothing but strange scorch marks and the lingering scent of ozone. A bizarre fog began to spread in remote areas, its appearance accompanied by sudden, inexplicable blackouts. Survivors spoke of feeling an oppressive presence within the fog, as though they were being watched by countless unseen eyes. In my own life, the phenomena grew even more terrifying. The journal's hum had intensified, becoming a low, pulsating vibration. The shadows in my home now moved openly, sliding across walls and ceilings with an intelligence that defied explanation. Once, I awoke to find the journal hovering inches above my desk, its pages flipping furiously as though caught in an invisible wind. But the most chilling moment came one evening when I glanced at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. For a fleeting instant, my reflection did not move with me. It stared back with an expression that was not my own, its eyes glinting with a malevolent light. I stumbled backward, and when I looked again, it was gone. It was then that I understood. The journal was not merely a relic of a dead world, but a conduit for the entity that had consumed it. The devourer of realities was aware of me now, its presence growing stronger with each passing day. The journal had become a gateway, and I was its unwitting sentinel. I sought answers wherever I could, scouring ancient texts and consulting those few who would still speak to me. Each lead ended in horror. One historian, an eccentric recluse named Mordain, agreed to examine the journal but disappeared 2 days later, leaving behind only a frantic note. "The veil is thin. It is here." My isolation deepened as those around me abandoned or vanished, but even in solitude, I could not escape the encroaching madness. The signs were everywhere. Blackened skies, failing electronics, and an ever-present hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. I realized with a sinking dread that the journal was no longer merely a threat to me. It was a harbinger of the end, and its influence was spreading far beyond the walls of my home. Part 4. The journal's revelations turned darker, its pages yielding fragments of a ritual that promised salvation, though the price it demanded was monstrous. I spent sleepless nights deciphering these grim instructions, piecing together a ceremony that could, at least temporarily, halt the devourer's advance. But the warnings etched into the margins of the text were explicit. Success demanded a vast sacrifice, one that would stain my soul beyond redemption. The ritual required certain materials, sigils to be drawn in fresh blood, ancient runes carved into stone, and offerings of flesh. These were not merely symbolic gestures, but conduits for unimaginable energy channeled directly to the force I sought to repel. The journal spoke of the ritual as a double-edged blade, one that could drive the devourer away only by satiating its insatiable hunger. It would take the lives of thousands to save billions. At first, I recoiled at the prospect. Such an act was unthinkable. Could I condemn so many to death, even for the sake of humanity's survival? The moral weight of the decision crushed me, and for days I left the journal untouched, retreating into an increasingly fragile sanity. But the signs around me continued to escalate. Reports of disappearances grew more frequent, with entire cities vanishing into silence. The black fog was no longer confined to isolated regions. It seeped into populated areas, bringing with it chaos and panic. And then, the dreams came again, more vivid and horrifying than ever before. I saw Earth as the dead world, its cities reduced to twisted ruins, its skies choked with alien constellations. The whispers grew louder, forming words that dripped with malice. You cannot stop it, only delay it. I awoke with the words echoing in my ears, my body trembling with a cold that felt as though it emanated from within. Desperation left me with no choice. I could not stand by and watch the world crumble while I held even the faintest hope of salvation. With trembling hands, I prepared for the ritual. The instructions were precise and maddeningly complex. The sigils had to be drawn at midnight, their lines unbroken and infused with the essence of the living. For this, I used my own blood, letting it drip from a shallow cut across my palm. The runes required placement at cardinal points, carved into slabs of black stone that I had to procure at great personal risk. Each rune took hours to inscribe, and with every strike of the chisel, I felt the weight of my actions deepen. The final component of the ritual was the most horrifying, an offering of flesh, taken from those who would never see the light of day again. The journal was explicit in its demands. The lives claimed by the ritual could not be random. They had to be gathered with intent, their deaths a deliberate acknowledgement of the price being paid. I wept as I considered what this meant, my mind racing through possibilities. I could not bring myself to kill, but the ritual seemed to suggest alternatives. Those already marked for death, those on the brink, might suffice. I visited the darkest corners of the city, seeking those whose lives had been abandoned by society. The terminally ill, the forgotten, the dying. I begged for their consent, offering them no lies about what their sacrifice would mean. To my astonishment, a few agreed, their gazes filled with a kind of grim resolve. They saw in my desperation a reflection of their own, and though I knew it would damn my soul, I accepted their sacrifices. The night of the ritual was a cacophony of terror and determination. The sigils glowed faintly beneath the pale light of a crescent moon, their lines pulsing with an otherworldly energy. The runes hummed in unison, vibrating the air with a low, guttural resonance that I felt in my bones. The sacrifices, those brave souls who had given themselves willingly, lay still within the circle, their faces calm even as I chanted the incantations scrawled within the journal's pages. As the final words left my lips, the air around me grew heavy and electric. A sound like distant thunder echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once, and the black fog began to seep into the ritual space. For a moment, I feared I had failed. that I had only hastened the devourer's arrival. But then the fog recoiled, as if struck by an unseen force. The ground trembled, and a deep, guttural roar reverberated through the air, shaking the very foundations of reality. I had done it. The devourer had been pushed back. Or so I thought. The victory was short-lived. The journal's pages turned blank after the ritual, their cryptic symbols replaced by a faint, shimmering void. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as though a thread had been tied to my heart and was being pulled taut. The sensation grew stronger, spreading through my limbs and into my mind. It was then that I realized the truth. The ritual had not repelled the devourer. It had merely redirected its attention onto me. The journal was not a tool of salvation, it was a trap, a beacon designed to lure the desperate into offering themselves as vessels. I had bound the devourer not to earth, but to my own soul, tethering it to this plane through the very act of defiance. The knowledge hit me like a hammer, leaving me gasping for breath. In the days that followed, I began to change. My reflection grew distorted, its eyes burning with a faint, inhuman light. The shadows in my home no longer moved of their own accord. They moved with me, as though responding to my unspoken will. I could feel the devourer's presence within me, a vast and unfathomable hunger that whispered of worlds beyond my comprehension. And yet, I was still me, or so I believed. My thoughts were my own, though they were tainted by the entity's influence. I knew that this state was temporary, that the devourer would consume me entirely in time. But before that could happen, I resolved to do one final act. I would write. Part 5. I write this now in the fleeting moments before my mind succumbs fully to the force I sought to repel. My hands tremble as I pen these words, not from fear alone, but from the weight of the knowledge that what I have done cannot be undone. The journal rests beside me, its pages empty, as though mocking my futile attempts to stave off the inevitable. I have become the vessel for the devourer, its consciousness stirring within me like a beast rousing from slumber. The transformation began subtly. At first, it was a faint thrumming sensation in the back of my skull, a vibration that grew stronger with each passing hour. My dreams no longer belonged to me. They were windows into countless other worlds, each one in the final throes of annihilation. I saw civilizations far grander than our own, their spires reaching into alien skies, reduced to rubble in the wake of the devourer's hunger. I heard their screams as though they were my own, and with each vision, I felt a small part of myself erode. The physical changes followed soon after. My reflection became a stranger, its features warped by faint otherworldly distortions. My eyes, once a dull and unremarkable gray, now glowed faintly in the darkness, as if lit from within by some infernal flame. Shadows clung to me like a second skin, their movements no longer dictated by the light, but by my own will. I realized with dawning horror that I was no longer entirely human, though what I had become, I could not say. But it was not only myself who suffered the consequences of my actions. The world around me began to reflect the growing presence of the devourer. The fog, which I had hoped to banish, returned with renewed vigor, creeping through the streets of nearby towns and leaving silence in its wake. Reports of disappearances skyrocketed, and those who remained spoke of strange phenomena. flickering lights, distorted reflections, and a pervasive sense of being watched. I could feel the devourer's hunger through the tether it had established with me. It was vast and unrelenting, a void that no amount of life could fill. And yet I knew that its focus had shifted, for now at least. My actions had delayed its arrival, but I had also ensured that its hunger would one day return. It was a reprieve, not a victory, and the price was one I had already begun to pay. It is with this grim understanding that I now commit my final act. The journal, though blank, retains its power. I can feel it even now, its presence a faint pulse that echoes my own heartbeat. I have tried to destroy it, through fire, through water, through any means I could imagine, but it resists all efforts, as though protected by the same force that binds it to the devourer. I have come to accept that it cannot be destroyed, only passed on. To that end, I have written this account, embedding it with all that I have learned. The journal is not merely a record of the devourer's conquests, it is a warning, one that has been sent across countless worlds in the hope that someone, somewhere might succeed where others have failed. It is a faint and terrible hope, but it is all that remains. I will leave the journal where it is certain to be found, perhaps by an archivist, as I once was, or by some curious soul drawn to its unknowable allure. They will read these words as I once read the words of another, and the cycle will begin anew. I cannot say whether this is cruelty or salvation, for I no longer trust my own judgment. The devourer's influence clouds my thoughts, twisting them in ways I cannot fully comprehend. Even as I write, I feel its presence growing stronger. The whispers have returned, louder now, their words clearer and more insistent. They speak of worlds yet to be consumed, of the countless lives that will fuel the devourer's endless hunger. They speak of me, not as a man, but as a tool, a fragment of the entity's will made flesh. I can feel myself slipping away, my thoughts blending with its incomprehensible vastness. Soon, I will be no more. To you who have found this journal, I offer only this: flee while you can. Leave this place and forget you ever laid eyes upon these words. The knowledge contained within these pages is not salvation. It is a beacon, a lure that draws the devourer ever closer. By reading this, you have invited its gaze, and it does not look away. But if you cannot bring yourself to flee, if you, like me, are drawn to the forbidden allure of understanding, then know this: the devourer cannot be stopped, only delayed. The ritual I performed was not a solution, but a postponement, a brief respite that comes at an unbearable cost. Should you choose to follow in my footsteps, know that the price will be yours to pay, and the consequences yours to bear. I leave this warning not out of hope, but out of necessity. The cycle must continue, for the alternative is a silence far more terrible than anything you can imagine. Perhaps you will find a way to succeed where I have failed. Perhaps you will uncover some secret hidden within the journal's endless horrors. But if you do not, if you, like so many others, succumb to its influence, then know that your story will be the next to be written within these pages. I can write no more. The whispers have become a roar, and my hands are no longer my own. The shadows gather around me, and I feel the devourer's gaze upon me. Its vast and unfathomable presence, pressing against the fragile boundaries of my mind. To whoever finds this, may you fare better than I. But know this above all else. Once the devourer sees, it does not look away. That was Journal of a Dead World by J.P. Netherane, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood. Otis, ever read something that made you wish you could unread it?
More times than I can count. But sometimes, Malcolm, it's the unread things that get to you the most. You just know they're waiting.
Fair point, my friend. Now, let's dig a little deeper, literally, with our next tale.
Our third tale tonight takes us into the heart of the jungle, where a team of researchers uncovers something buried, something that should have remained forgotten. Prepare yourself for We Dug Too Deep by Kyle Harrison, performed by me, Otis Jiry. In the scientific community, there are far too many times when we have to give up and declare failure before we ever acknowledge success. And for almost 6 years, this dig site in the deep Argentine jungle appeared to be a perfect example. In fact, I was even one of the people who vocalized that we should be using our resources elsewhere. There were excavations in Saudi Arabia or Yemen that showed a lot more promise. Yet, for some reason, the bigwigs back at the university I worked for insisted on pouring money into a lost cause. I didn't see the benefit of any of it until last week, when we got a transmission of jubilation. Headquarters, this is Research Station Ebon. You copy? The radio chirped. Go ahead, Site Ebon, someone said as I listened at a distance. We've finally broken through the mantle and found our first evidence of structures here. Repeat, we have found it. The scientist on the other end of the line said, their voice shaky with exhilaration. When I heard that news, I hopped over to comm and took over. A research site, Ivan. This is Surveyor Chief Ailes. I understand you've something we're talking about? Damn right we do. Get Bishop down here. This will make world records. An older man's voice responded. I requested they send at least a scan of something to confirm their findings. About an hour later, we got a picture of a tablet. It looked like it was in a shallow grave of some kind, but most of the skulls were either pulverized or turned to dust already. There were scratches and markings on the tablet. I immediately recognized the similarities between them and the dead languages we discovered in Karanis and Cardiff. I did my best not to smile and began comparing them to previous finds, hoping to confirm my suspicions. Professor Gamble was one of the people back at the university who insisted a lost civilization could still exist deep in the heart of our unexplored jungles. And now, after all this time, he was about to have his day in the sun, I thought. God, he'll be insufferable. I turned off comms and gave my team a look and a shrug. You heard them. If it's legit, then the director ought to know. By the next morning, it was confirmed that a new team of surveyors would be dispatched to the dig site to assist in the investigation, and I would be head of the team. Been a while since you got your hands dirty, eh? Director Bishop asked. Knowing the professor, I won't have much work left to do by the time I get there, I told him. My team consisted of about 7 researchers, 2 archaeologists, and 3 excavators, and we left first thing the next day. It would be a 3 to 4 day trip to reach the research site, and I definitely didn't want Gamble to hog all the glory. Not that it mattered much, since his daughter was likely already singing his praises all across the scientific community. I sincerely hope all of this fanfare is worth it, I thought as I finished packing my things and made for the train station. Reaching the site would be challenging. Direct routes to such remote locations simply didn't exist. We had local guides take us from the closest airport, trekking through the jungle in both sweltering heat and cold rain. By the time we reach them, there won't be much left to dig up, one of the excavators lamented. I wasn't sure they understood how this whole process worked. Digs like this could take years. We had to be careful not to accidentally cause a collapse. Surveying a geological area would be first and foremost, and that would be where I came in. If I could possibly get a good scan of the entire area where the first discovery was made, we would know what we were working with. I did my best not to shake my head at how silly I sounded. I was excited for no reason. All we had as proof was Gamel's words, and it was entirely possible he'd been exaggerating simply to make us rush down here. If that was the case, I would be furious, I thought, as we did our best to push through the uneven trails. When we finally reached the dig site, I spotted one of the massive cranes we'd airdropped into the area and shouted out to whoever might be operating it that we had arrived. There was a strange purple oil smeared on the nearby trees and rocks that seemed to kill some of the foliage and leave bizarre scars on the ground. As we got closer, however, I couldn't help but notice that there were marks against the metallic door and steps. Long, sharp gashes like the kind a wild animal might make. As we moved even closer, I saw an arm dangling out the side of the crane. I reached for the door, unlatching it, feeling my heart skip a beat as a worker collapsed out from the enclosed space. We stood there, confused and startled, as we stared at the man, realizing that he had been attacked. Half of his face looked like it had been ripped off somehow, and his chest was covered in deep open wounds. It said for the main excavation. We need to find out what happened here, I told the team as we hurried from the crane toward the makeshift trail that led to the inner jungle. It was here that I caught my first glimpse of the ruins they'd found. A few explosives were sitting still at different intervals, perhaps unused or being set aside for a later structured collapse. But the entrance they found looked like it was a canal of some kind leading deeper into the earth. There was simply no way it was a rock formation. That much was certain, I realized, as I marveled at the smooth design. How old do you think it might be? Anne, a microbiologist, asked as she noticed that there were small stone hatches that seemed designed to filter something for the canal. One of them was broken in half and had the look of a handprint on it. One with only 3 main fingers and a long indentation at the bottom, like a misshapen toad of some kind. Yet still distinctive enough that it looked like it had been placed there on purpose. Perhaps as a way to open and close the hatch? Alice, we've taken a look around the dig and can't find anything. Not yet, anyway. It looks like everyone has up and vanished. My security officer, Sullivan, informed me. Do a wider search. This place is big. They might be at a different section. I told him as I paused and looked around to see how far down they'd gone. Just by the evidence of sediment at my eye level, it looked like they'd been pushing through for at least a week by the time they found this spot. After surveying the ruins further, we found additional canals with similar designs. Suddenly, someone called my name from another section of the site, shouting that it was an emergency. I ran to meet them, a bit taken aback, to see another large construction vehicle tilted over upside down. There'd been an accident, I realized, as I saw dirt and blood smeared everywhere near the stone. Behind the massive, overturned vehicle, after an entire area had been given away from the collapse, we saw an entrance. Anne took one of the lanterns we'd brought with us and then moved closer, trying to see into the dark, dank hole. The air felt drier, stiff, and bitter. It reminded me of the smell a mortuary might have after a fresh embalming. Do you think the rest of the team went down? To see how far they could get? She asked. We started into the hole, looking at the angled stone tunnels and wondering what sort of tools ancient man might have used to make this. the design is not dissimilar to the pyramids, narrow and cramped. This might be a tomb meant for royalty, I said aloud, as I noticed we had to bend over to make our way further. It was a common practice in ancient times to bury the dead in such elaborate places. Sometimes I wondered if our ancestors built these complex tombs to confound future generations, knowing we couldn't resist exploring the unknown. "Wait, do you hear that?" Anne asked as we paused. We'd gone far enough that I couldn't see a pinprick of light from outside in the jungle canopy, and I was struggling to figure out where the sound was coming from. Then I realized it was from deeper in the tomb. It sounded a whisper, a low mumbling voice that was floating through the air. Honestly, it gave me the chills. Must be the wind, I said nervously, as we walked a little further down the corridor. The noise got louder. It wasn't just a whisper. It sounded like someone in pain, and the noise was accompanied by footsteps. Both of us stopped in our tracks, holding our lanterns up as the sound got closer. There was something in the dark, not but a few feet from us, and both of us were as stiff as statues until the stranger stepped into the light. I recognized Professor Gamble immediately, but his eyes were filled with dread, and I noticed his left arm was covered in some kind of dark, slimy substance. He looked at me and attacked, pushing me to the stone wall, and Anne shouted in alarm. I shook back, screaming for him to let go of me as we fought there in the cramped space. At last he relented and stumbled back, his eyes glistening with confusion. "What has happened? How are you here?" he muttered. "We got your transmission a few days ago, Professor. Please, calm down and explain yourself," I insisted. The other man was clearly delusional. He was mumbling something about the transmission and then collapsed to the ground, trembling. He also started spouting numbers over and over, coordinates of some kind, I realized as Anne and I helped him to his feet. "We need to get him out of here," I shouted. I grabbed my radio and demanded that a medical team meet us near the entrance, only to discover there was strong static blocking our communications down there. We dragged Gamble out, and I ordered CPR as soon as the nurse arrived. About an hour later, he was stable in a tent near the outskirts of the dig site. Something terrified him, almost to the point of a panic attack, Sullivan remarked and added. We checked all around the area by a 5-mile radius. Still no sign of other survivors, although we did find 3 more corpses, all with signs of burns and lesions and scars. I made sure we had come prepared, I thought. But now this whole thing felt like one big mistake, and I'd find a way to fix it. Or so I hoped. It also felt like time was running out. 15 minutes. Fan out. Report anything unusual. Watch for wildlife, I said, as I bent over to find anything that the man had brought from down there. His hands were covered in soot. "What happened down there, Professor? What's made you so afraid?" For a moment, it looked like he dared not to speak. Perhaps he thought that if he refused to give us answers, the horrors he'd witnessed would not be real. We were digging near the south trench, as I knew we were close. The east vestibule was already in sight, but it wasn't a good entryway. Whatever built this thing clearly didn't intend for humans to find it. I realized that when I saw the canals. You saw them too, eh? They're designed to filter out the air and allow liquid breathers to survive in this enclosure. It would seem that this was once a proud underwater kingdom. That's my theory. And once we found our way into that dark abyss, I confirmed it. I thought there'd be no signs of life after all this time. How could there be? In a place buried and forgotten, nothing could survive. But while I took into account that nothing could live down here, I failed to understand there are types of death we're not privy to. We that walk here on this earth believe that is all that's here. But those Saronian beasts are death incarnate, shambling to spread their plague to the surface. He grabbed my face, gripping it hard. I was certain he might try to peel my skin off. We must seal it again. The accident opened a way for the plague to spread, unimpeded. The crew was infected in hours. The spores, they spread around the rocks. The very air around you is infected. Leave this place. Destroy it all and never look back. I turned toward one of my own crew, coughing profusely, realizing that Gamel might be right about his rants. What had they stumbled into? We were too late to stop this? Gamel also began to cough up blood as we moved closer to the communications tower. Meanwhile, my security chief had just returned and confirmed none of the equipment was working. That strange oily mess we saw on our way into the area, it's up there too. All over the place, Sullivan told us. He looked scared. He wasn't telling me everything. What else was up there? Out with it, Anne ordered. It would seem the dig crew were quarantining themselves up there, sir. Most of them are dead, but there is one. I wouldn't use the word survivor, honestly, because, God, it's so messed up. Enough. Lead the way. Anne, I need you to stay here and make sure the professor gets medical attention, I barked. Sullivan made the sign of the cross and led me to the tower, pushing the door open for me to smell the putrefied death within. As soon as I saw the corpses, all huddled together as though either trying to shelter or kill one another, it was difficult to ascertain which. I realized that my security chief had been holding back a lot more than expected. All of them looked like they had either been disemboweled or had attempted to mutilate one another in such a fashion. Their hands had been woven into each other's abdomens or backsides, their bones, skin, and organs torn apart, tying the corpses into an unusual knot formation. It reminded me of how one might come across the tail of rats wound together if they were caught in a trap, and it made me wonder how these people spent their final moments suffocating and struggling. Then I spotted the survivor, or rather, I heard them. It was a low wheeze over in the corner, a shriveled-up older woman hunched against the ground with her back firmly against the wall. I saw the reason for her labored breathing was because her chest was exposed, ripped apart by her own bare hands. Between the dangling flesh, I saw fresh bone and blood also pushed apart, pulled out like confetti and strewn on the floor. In its place, the woman had gathered stones around her, not as a protective barrier but as a final meal. She would weakly pick up the stones one by one and push them haphazardly into her body. No matter what was there, whether vital organ or not, she shoved the rocks into her open wounds, repeating the same phrase over and over. Maw of flesh in endless darkness, open wide and buried alive. Into the ground they hid from its mouth. Now opened and hungering for life. Seal the hole. Seal it. My God, I said, trying to comprehend how all of this fell apart in mere days since we contacted them. They did this to themselves. Do you believe what Gamel said about the lizard creatures below? Could it be that there's a form of death that can act in a sentient manner? One of my researchers asked as they examined the corpse amalgamation to the left. Given what we see here, anything is possible. We should make a report to the director, then rendezvous at the nearest outpost. We can't stay here. Quarantining the area would be the safest option until we can determine whether anything can be salvaged, I said as I walked away from the old woman. She wheezed, repeating the same phrase again. Sir, perhaps we should give her a merciful death. Surely it's pure hell to be doing this to herself, Sullivan asked. She wheezed and hacked up blood, barely sputtering. Must live. Death is how it spreads. Keep him alive, or it will be too late for all of you. We warily exited the tower, confused and frightened by her words. Did she mean the professor? Was he also infected? Why had he not acted as insane as the others? I looked down the hole where the old man had stumbled out, trying to pinpoint where Anne had taken him. Then I saw the fresh bloodstains that trailed into the darkness. Oh my God! The professor must have Anne. I shouted as I ran to the pedestal below. Sullivan was right behind me, ordering a few men to grab their guns as we rushed into the dark corridor. "Sir, this is clearly a trap. You heard that woman. Gamble must be luring us in there to unleash whatever else is still buried," he told me worriedly. "Can't leave her behind either," I insisted, igniting my lantern and hurrying down the cramped space. As we hurried inside, I tried to call out to my colleague, but my security chief cautioned me. "We mustn't alert Gamble to our position. We should turn down our lanterns, too." With the lights down, it was difficult to see where we were going, so I kept close to the walls. As my fingers slipped across the bricks, I felt indentations, scars as old as this world itself, and something about them seemed familiar. Holding the dim light toward the markings, I realized there was another form of the dead language. This one was different and certainly more animalistic, but something about them demanded my attention, insisting I go further into this abyss to see what nightmares awaited. We were almost on our bellies, crawling forward toward what looked like a blinding light. A furnace, perhaps? It felt like we'd gone for miles, and I was so thirsty. But I could hear screams. Anne was close by. Finally, we reached a subterranean cavern with upside-down structures that revealed these aquatic people were mostly isolated and possibly spent their entire whole lives here. Amid the structures, I saw Gamble standing next to what looked like a bold, bright miniature sun which burned everything within the vicinity of the strange, secluded ruin. He was reaching toward the endlessly spiraling star, his hand completely burned off and revealing a skeleton covered with that purple oil, and he was holding Anne toward it, forcing her to gaze on it. "Behold the chasm to another life, another death. This is just one such gateway. I've seen endless possibilities. Infinity demands that we must all suffer the same," he babbled as Sullivan raised his weapon and aimed for his head. "Anne, get ready to run," I told her. Her eyes were filled with tears, bloodshot, with that purple oil streaming down her face. What had she seen? What was on the other side of this supposed portal? Sullivan made the shot. The bullet ripped through the professor's head and froze just as it exited his cranium on the front. Some unseen force held the broken pieces of bone and sinew and blood all together, pushing them back into his exposed head. Then it flew backward, straight toward my security chief and into his chest. I staggered backward and looked as blood pooled in his chest, causing Sullivan to collapse in shock. Then the undead form of Gamble laughed as he tossed Anne straight into the star. All I heard was her screaming as her body turned to ash, and I joined in yelling, watching as strange creatures slithered out of the stones. "You should never have come. Never. Now you will always be here," the professor screamed. The creatures were half fish, using vibrations and noises that no human could ever produce. With grotesque humanoid forms, twisted with crustacean-like features, they skittered toward the star, feasting on the spoils. Professor Gamble's body turned into spores, pushing their way toward me as the rest of my team hurried to escape the ruins. We didn't dare look back or imagine the endless deathless creatures, all of them screaming and angry, that now crawled through the earth to us. We made it to our main site, and I ordered my team to ignite the charges. We'd sink this place back into oblivion that it came from. The explosions ripped through the ground and destroyed the stones as we watched from a distance. I could see the Saurian trying to race and escape and be buried. How long would they continue to be trapped there? Had they simply been in stasis this entire time, waiting for a release? There were many questions I couldn't answer, but as we departed the research site, I forced my team to agree on the same narrative. We found nothing, Professor Gamble and his team were ashamed of their lack of progress and disappeared into the jungle. The university would be told that the jungle was a lost cause, a money pit. I pray they believe us and don't dig again, for those crawling deaths will still scratch at the dirt, desperate to fulfill their otherworldly purpose. That was We Dug Too Deep by Kyle Harrison, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Malcolm, ever feel like some discoveries are better left unfound?
All the time, Otis. Humanity's reach often exceeds its grasp, and as tonight's tales show, the consequences can be dire.
Well said.
Horror fans, don't miss out on even more exclusive content. By joining our patrons area, you'll gain access to extended editions of this show, featuring extra stories and ad-free listening across our network.
It's easy to join. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons to head to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, and you'll unlock a treasure trove of chilling tales dating back over a decade.
For just $7.99 a month, or less with an annual plan, you can double your terror and support indie creators who make this possible.
So don't wait. Join us in the Patrons area today, and let's keep the scares coming.
If you haven't subscribed to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on YouTube yet, make sure you do. And don't forget to click the bell icon so you're always the first to hear when new episodes drop.
And while you're browsing, check out Nightmare Fuel, my midweek podcast where I share sinister stories by the fire. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on X, formerly Twitter, as well as Facebook and Instagram.
And if you want to connect with me personally, just search for Otis Jiry. I'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's stories.
And let's not forget the talented authors who make this show possible. Be sure to look them up and support their work.
Until next Sunday, stay curious, keep one eye on the shadows, and remember, sometimes the secrets we uncover are the ones that haunt us the most.
Sweet dreams, my fellow denizens of the dark. Sweet dreams.
Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's otis@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel,
do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.